There are those who say that to end poverty in America, we must go back to the old days of raising taxes again and again and again. Well, I don't doubt that they mean well in their own way, but their ideas are hopelessly old-fashioned. They just don't understand that the American people are tired of the tax and take mentality. And so I know are all of you. And I'm going to be ashamed of myself in a second for what I'm going to say, but I understand they did borrow their campaign song from your state. It's called Deep in the Heart of Taxes. Isn't that awful?
Good morning. It is Monday, January the 2nd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch, Alex-Epstein, something about Damar Hamlin from a medical doctor, and Jinx, chapter 26. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now, the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, Biblical Principles to Defeat the Devil for January the 2nd. Lord, I waited patiently for you, and you heard my cry. You lifted me out of a slimy pit of mud and mire, and you set my feet firmly on a rock. You put a new song in my mouth and gave me a hymn of praise I can sing to you. Let those around me see and learn to put their trust also in you. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for January the 2nd.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch.
Economists love to talk about incentives, but the bottom line is that people hate being controlled or manipulated, even when done through voluntary institutions. This is one of the most important tensions in capitalism. Tyler Cowen. The miracle of markets is that they align incentives with human action. As markets exceed normal exploitation of incentives and transcend into control or manipulation territory, human action inherently resists. In this tension, a valuable service is provided to society, the resistance of control juxtaposed with the benefit of incentives.
And that was There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit from Dr. Brian Sutterer on the injury that happened to Damar Hamlin this evening.
The most rare things we can see in sports medicine, as Damar Hamlin went down with what appeared to be cardiac arrest after taking this hit on the field. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Suter, and on this channel, I try to teach you about the sports medicine world and give you some insight into what we see on the field. What we saw happen tonight is not related to any sort of vaccines. This is almost certainly something called commotio cordis, an extremely rare condition that's one of those things that we typically only think we're going to read about in textbooks. Essentially, what can happen is if you have a blunt trauma to the chest that occurs at exactly the right time in the cardiac electrical cycle, your heart can be sent into cardiac arrest. As Hamlin comes in here, we can see this square hit to the front of his chest. We see him get back up momentarily before ultimately collapsing back down to the ground and requiring CPR on the field. This is a tracing of our heart's electrical activity. Basically, this is one cycle of the heart squeezing. It starts off with this P wave, which is the electrical activity of the atrium at the top of the heart squeezing, then the QRS complex, which is going to be the ventricles acting, but then the last phase is this T wave, where the ventricle basically depolarizes and kind of resets to get ready for the next cycle. For commotio cordis to happen, you have to suffer this blunt trauma to the chest at exactly the right moment, specifically on this upstroke of the T wave, in order for the heart to then be sent into this arrhythmia and subsequent cardiac arrest. This is one of those things that not only do you have to have a high enough force, but it has to happen within milliseconds of a time window, because if that impact comes at any other time in this electrical cycle, you're fine. You don't go into this. But when it happens at just this right time during this upstroke of the T wave, and if it's high enough, then you can have this thing called commotio cordis. We typically think of it happening in baseball players whenever they get hit in the middle of the chest with a hard thrown ball, but unfortunately that looks like what is most likely to have happened here with Hamlin. Treatment like this is obviously CPR and defibrillation as quickly as possible, because this can absolutely be a life-threatening thing. Again, this is not something that people should go speculate about vaccines or anything like that causing this cardiac arrest. There was a clear contact, a clear trauma, and I think a clear reason why, unfortunately, this happened for Hamlin. My thoughts and prayers go out to the player, go out to his family, everybody else there on the field, the medical staff taking care of him. This is an extremely serious thing. One of those conditions that, like I said, you hope, you pray, you never actually see as a medical provider. But hopefully this was educational. Let me know, as always, any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.
And that was Dr. Brian Sutterer about the injury to Damar Hamlin, and I'm praying for Mr. Hamlin and his family. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit of Alex-Epstein.
The basic thing is that by default, everyone is poor. So poverty is the natural condition of human beings. And the reason is because the planet doesn't give us many usable resources, and it gives us a lot of threats. So the normal condition of life is it's deficient and it's dangerous. And the only way to come out of that is to be very productive. And the only way to be very productive is to use machines to produce a lot more value than we can do using our fairly meager physical bodies. And so what energy does is it allows us to use machines to produce 10, 50, 100 times more value so that we can go from a deficient and dangerous world to an abundant and safe world. And my observation is that those of us in the wealthy world, we all do this using significant amounts of fossil fuel, because that's the only form of energy that can be low cost, reliable, power every type of machine, not just ones based on electricity, and that can do it for billions of people in thousands of places. So our whole standard of living depends on fossil fuels. And yet there's been a movement to say that poor people should somehow not use fossil fuels, even though we're not able to do that ourselves. And I've pointed out this is incredibly destructive. If you look at the poorer places that have risen out of poverty, most notably China, but also India, they've done it by quintupling their use of fossil fuels to go from unproductive and poor to relatively productive and prosperous. And so what we've seen, though, with the energy crisis is not only are we opposing poor people bringing themselves up with fossil fuels, but we're restricting the availability of fossil fuels to the point where the wealthy world is suffering massively as well, which means the poor world is going to suffer even more. So what you're seeing in the U.S., we see rising electricity prices, particularly in the East. We see rising gasoline prices. But in Europe, it's incomparably worse. I mean, there you have fertilizer factories shutting down, which affects food production. You have all kinds of people saying, like, you can't, in Spain, it was you can't cool buildings below 81 degrees Fahrenheit. You see restrictions on hot water all over Germany. And we haven't even hit winter yet. And so you just put it this way, Europe is afraid of winter. That is embarrassing. Human beings should not be afraid of winter for the last 75 years at least.
And that was Alex-Epstein about giving just a basic primer on the value of fossil fuels. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Chapter 26 of Hijinks.
Chapter 26. No, Blackford had said to his mother, no, under no circumstances would he be late. Yes, he said to his mother, he did realize how very interesting it would be to attend the garden party the Queen was giving for what she termed the academic elite of Oxford and Cambridge, etc., including the trustees and their families. And yes, he was very pleased to have been invited ex officio as the stepson of the chairman of the Board of Trustees of Cavendish Laboratories. And as your dutiful son, Mother. You are more than my dutiful son, darling, Lady Sharkey had said. You are my beautiful, wonderful boy. Blackford at the other end of the telephone closed his eyes in exasperation, but let it pass. He would rather suffer than reprimand his gentle mother. His stepfather, Sir Alex Sharkey, was similarly disposed. Not that putting up with Carol was difficult. She was the most obliging, most retiring, devoted, affectionate woman, so unlike American Sir Alec had both known and become familiar with in books and movies, the brassy, hard-boiled types. There was nothing hard-boiled about Carol Oak Sharkey, but after her divorce and remarriage to an Englishman in 1941, she had made it a point to live as the British did, and a royal garden party was no mere frivolity on her social schedule. Blackford wondered vaguely whether, given that there were over 1,000 guests scheduled to be there, his path and the Queen's would even cross. He half hoped they would not, half hoped they would, 3 years having passed since their fleeted encounter, first at Buckingham Palace, then at Windsor Castle, including the time spent entirely alone. There had been no communication of any sort since that time, and Blackford had never even been tempted to take the initiative. Indeed, he thought twice before accepting his mother's invitation. But curiosity and nostalgia, even a kind of loyalty, prompted him to accept the invitation of the most glamorous woman in the world. And now they were bound, the three of them, for the palace in the limousine rented by Sir Alec. As they drove through the park, their limousine, so bright and spectacular when it set out from Portland Place, became just one of many limousines rented for the bright occasion in that long caravan headed for Buckingham Palace. Nature, that day in London, was being fully cooperative with the Queen. It was warm and sunny. There was a light breeze, the children were playing in the park, and the tourists were ogling outside the palace gates. When, still a few hundred yards from the gates, their vehicle almost ceased to move under the constipating press of luxury cars and promenaders, Sir Alex said abruptly that they should leave the motor car and walk. It is too beautiful outside to sit in the car. Lady Sharkey said something or other about her new shoes not being very fit for walking, but it was said routinely. Sir Alec exchanged an understanding with the driver on where they should look out for him on leaving the palace a couple of hours later, and soon they were walking. Lady Carol Sharkey, with one arm clasping her husband's elbow, the other eased between her son's arm and his side. Blackford suddenly realized that he was quite nervous. They arrived, their credentials having been examined, in the garden well ahead of the Queen's appearance. They were served a fruit punch and finger sandwiches, and they strolled about the garden here and there, Sir Alec pausing to greet fellow trustees of Cavendish Laboratories. The garden was not exactly full. It would have needed an additional 10,000 guests to fill the garden of Buckingham Palace. Suddenly the orchestra stopped its afternoon music. There was a pause, and then, God Save the Queen, As at a distance from the garden entrance to the palace, the Queen emerged, followed by Prince Richard and a half-dozen brightly attired ladies-in-waiting and aides. She wore a pale yellow pleated chiffon dress and a perky little veiled hat of the same material, perched on her blonde hair at an angle. She looked directly ahead and smiled, rather absently. But after a few steps, she stopped suddenly, stooped over, and lifted up from the lawn a little boy, evidently an old affection, because even at a distance one could hear his giggles at being kissed so resoundingly. She let him down with a gentle pat on his silk-clad bottom, and was quickly surrounded by his parents and other adoring subjects. And from that moment on, what had begun as a procession relaxed into the informality of another garden party, though it was plain that guests at the party attempted, without ostentation, so to maneuver as to be in the way of the casual circle the Queen was engaged in describing. It was while she was addressing the rector of St. Andrews, Sir John Appleton, that she caught his eye. Blackford was chatting with one of his stepfather's elderly friends. The Queen, on seeing him, began to fan herself briskly with the antique yellow ivory instrument she carried, sometimes as if a scepter, sometimes as a ferule, sometimes as an adornment. She continued her conversation, and there was a little pause, pending which Blackford might have taken the initiative in approaching her, but did not. Queen Caroline smiled at Sir John, and walked, followed by two aides. Prince Richard had left the Queen to make his own counterclockwise circuit, and the young princes with their nannies were playing with other children, toward Blackford. "Why, Mr. Oakes, how very nice to see you again," nodding her head ever so slightly and smiling warmly, but also warily, though there was no disguising the brightness of her eyes. "Ma'am, may I present my mother, Lady Sharkey, and my stepfather, Sir Alex Sharkey?" The lady curtsied. The gentleman bowed deeply. The Queen acknowledged them. "I am very pleased to meet you," and to Lady Sharkey. "Your son engaged in some architectural research several years ago that led him to Windsor Castle, where, along with a few other guests, he stayed for a day or two." And to Blackford, "Did you complete your project, Mr. Oakes? Did you find the secret to the Great Wall of China? Do we know why it survives while so many other structures do not? This is the sort of thing the Massachusetts Institute of Technology specializes in, is it not?" "It was Yale I came from, ma'am." "Indeed, Yale. It is in California, isn't it?" "Yes, of course, San Francisco. Silly of me to forget." Blackford smiled. She had not changed. "Yes, ma'am, but don't be embarrassed. I know some Californians who don't realize that Yale is in San Francisco." Queen Caroline looked Blackford directly in the eyes, and there was a trace of an amused wink, an amusement at the play. There was a brief pause, after which nothing the Queen might have said would have surprised Blackford. What she said was, "Good afternoon, Mr. Oakes, Sir Alec, Lady Sharkey." She smiled, and her entourage alongside resumed her casual round. Lady Sharkey was ecstatic. "How nice, darling, that she remembers your visit. But you know, dear, she is quite wrong about Yale. Evidently she confused you. I couldn't quite understand your reply." But Blackford had been accosted by a meteorologist who had worked side by side with Rufus during the war. If he heard his mother's question, he did not heed it, and she did not repeat it, her mind wandering to other of the visual delights that sunny afternoon at Buckingham Palace.
And that was Chapter 26 of Jinx by William F. Buckley, Jr. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. Until next time, remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.